From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The United Kingdom has a new prime minister as Russia shuts down a natural gas pipeline to Germany. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Joe Sternberg in London and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. Liz Truss was the foreign secretary in Boris Johnson's government most recently, but she has now won the Conservative Party vote to succeed him as prime minister. Recall that Johnson announced in July he would resign, triggering this leadership change mid-election. There were originally several nominees, which Conservative members of Parliament whittled down, and then the final two went to party members for a vote, and Truss won with about 57% of that, about 81,000 votes in all from the Conservative Party members. Here's a clip of the new Prime Minister Liz Truss explaining the challenges ahead.
We now face severe global headwinds caused by Russia's appalling war in Ukraine and the aftermath of COVID. Now is the time to tackle the issues that are holding Britain back. We need to build roads, homes and broadband faster. We need more investment and great jobs in every town and city across our country. We need to reduce the burden on families and help people get on in life. I know that we have what it takes to tackle those challenges. Of course, it won't be easy, but we can do it.
Joe, can you give us a better sense from your perch in London of who is Liz Truss? How did she win this leadership race? And are the analysts right to be hearing some echoes, perhaps, of Margaret Thatcher here?
Yeah, well, I think actually your last two questions are related to each other because she did win the race among Conservative Party members by channeling big elements of Thatcherism. Now, I mean, the immediate parallel that people are always drawing here is with tax policy, because I think that one of Liz Truss's signature policy ideas in recent months has been this notion of using tax cuts as a way to alleviate the inflation or cost of living crisis over here and to try to unstick the economy. So, people are seeing in her proposal to reduce corporate tax rates or to dial back a planned increase in the payroll tax, are seeing echoes of that 1980s Thatcherite supply-sidism. But I think there's also a deeper parallel there, which is Truss talks about a real sense of optimism about Britain's private sector as opposed to the government, and emphasizes a lot the need for private entrepreneurship, risk-taking, investment to really drive the British economy and society along. And along with that, I think comes this real sense that economic growth is the solution to a lot of the problems that the country has, and not just redistribution. And so I think that it was that kind of message, which is fundamentally a very optimistic message, explains what has propelled her into that top job this time.
And to my mind, this kind of optimistic agenda was the best case for Brexit to begin with. I mean, the advantages of being in a trading bloc like the European Union are you have harmonized regulations, so it's easy to trade across borders. And if you're losing that advantage, the corresponding advantage you can get by leaving is to do a sort of deregulatory and trade agenda, a competition agenda, and to say that, we're losing that ease of trade, but we're going to be more competitive outside without the EU putting all these regulations on the economy. And so, I mean, to my mind, this is kind of makes sense, Mene, and particularly if you look at something like this planned increase in the corporate tax rate in the UK to 26% from 19%. If you're trying to compete with the people across the English Channel, it seems like that would be the exact wrong way to go.
Yeah, I think you nailed it on what British people thought the promise of Brexit would be, and I think there's a pretty widespread sense, especially among members of the Conservative Party, that their leaders had failed to deliver on that promise. So I kind of want to back up to 2016, around the period that the Brexit referendum was passed. I didn't have a front row seat to it in the way that Joe did, but of course followed it. And what I remember is that, there were a couple of reasons why the British population decided to vote in favor of it. One was maybe some skepticism toward immigration, cultural change. You saw this in a lot of the lower income, sort of northern territories of the country where the economy has declined somewhat. And so that was part of the coalition, and I think that's what a lot of American audiences focused on. But just as important, and probably even more important from the perspective of the Conservative Party members who really backed it, was the idea of this kind of economic liberation moment for the UK economy, because they felt that they had been overburdened by the European Union's trade restrictions and by their regulatory policies on how businesses could operate. And the idea was that Britain freeing itself from the EU would then allow them to strike up more bilateral trade deals with other countries and really just kind of supercharge the economy. And so it really seemed like the Boris Johnson administration was expected to kind of synthesize both of these sides of Brexit. On the one hand, he did promise some economic support for kind of the downtrodden parts of the British economy outside of the City of London. But then there was also this expectation that there would be a lot of trade deal making, and that really didn't materialize. He seemed to lean much more into the green subsidies and things like that than he did on the sort of free market economic policy front. And so part of Liz Truss's mandate is to really deliver on sort of the more optimistic side of kind of free market oriented deal making. I think she has some bona fides there. I mean, as first trade secretary and then as a foreign secretary, she did push through these trade deals with Australia and Japan. So far, there hasn't been one with the United States, but I think people are really watching and seeing whether the promise that she's made to sort of recharge the UK economy can be delivered through this more free market approach.
Well, let's listen for a moment to a man we've mentioned a couple times, Boris Johnson, the outgoing prime minister, throwing his support behind Liz Truss.
This is a tough time for the economy. This is a tough time for families up and down the country. We can and we will get through it, and we will come out stronger the other side. But I say to my fellow Conservatives, it's time for politics to be over, folks. It's time for us all to get behind Liz Truss and her team and her programme and deliver for the people of this country. Because that is what the people of this country want, that's what they need, and that's what they deserve.
Joe, how would you size up Boris Johnson's legacy as prime minister? I mean, he entered office an extremely popular figure, and I agree with Monet. I at least expected him to push toward the kind of competitive Brexit that we've been talking about. But is it true now that maybe under Liz Truss we are going to get the kind of turn for the Conservative Party away from a redistribution agenda that might make sense?
Yeah, I think that Boris Johnson's legacy is going to be very complicated, I think both politically and policy-wise. I mean, one thing you need to say at the outset, and this is a big part of the complexity there, is that your view of him, even within the Conservative Party, depends an awful lot on where you were sitting. And so you had this dynamic where he was always much more popular with the party's grassroots out in the countryside than he was with his own members of parliament here in London, even those members of parliament who owed their seats to this historic electoral mandate that he won in the December 2019 election. And so there's already speculation about whether he might try to stage some kind of comeback at some point. And a lot of that is built around this popularity that he may enjoy at the grassroots level. But against that, you have just the economic disaster that is unfolding around the country right now. I mean, it's expected to be the slowest growing major economy in the world next year. Energy prices are skyrocketing. This is causing enormous pain for both households and businesses, especially small businesses. Consumer and business confidence are all plunging. There is a growing sense of malaise here, and he seemed completely unequal to tackling that. So I think that this is an opportunity for Truss to come in with this much more, optimistic message, but also a message that is very different from what people have heard either from Boris Johnson or his two Conservative predecessors as prime minister going back to 2010, Theresa May or David Cameron. This is a major break for the Conservative Party about 12 years into their current period governing the country, and it probably comes not a moment too soon for them.
One last thought on this, Monet, I would pick up on the point that you made about the fact that we still don't have a US-UK free trade deal post-Brexit, and it seems to me that there's one party to blame, and that's the Biden administration in Washington has still accepted this turn away from trade that we've seen in recent years and recent decades. And I think it's a mistake. I mean, if we want to help the British Conservatives pursue this post-Brexit success that we're talking about, a free trade deal would be a good way to do it. And by the way, it would be good for consumers in the United States to get things that they're buying from British products without the extra tax added onto them. And in the absence of any real push in Washington for this, there's an interesting May story. This is from Reuters. It says, Britain will sign its first state-level trade agreement with the U.S. Corn Belt state of Indiana on Friday, with more to come as London eyes ways to expand commercial trade despite Washington's decision to halt trade talks on a national-level free trade deal. And the story goes on to say that Britain is talking to about 20 states looking for these state-level trade deals. But I don't know why this shouldn't be on President Biden's agenda, particularly as we're talking about inflation. Rolling back some of the President Trump's tariffs has been floated as a way to take a one-time bite out of these inflation figures we've been seeing. And I think doing a trade deal with Britain would be in a similar spirit.
That sounds right to me. I mean, I think it should reflect as an embarrassment on the Biden administration that you have UK diplomats forced to talk to governors and state houses about striking these trade deals. American consumers, thankfully, aren't struggling quite as much as their British counterparts, but definitely are looking for economic relief, are looking to their leaders to find ways to sort of keep our economy going strong. And the fact that the Biden administration has completely slow-footed its approach to international trade so much should definitely be counted against it. It's interesting, again, to go back a couple of years, President Trump was very enthusiastic about the possibility of a bilateral trade deal. Maybe he could have worked faster to lay the groundwork for striking that with the UK, but it definitely fit into his philosophy of we want to do more bilateral deals as opposed to multinational deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which he scuttled. He wanted to do one-on-one deals specifically with American allies, and the UK seemed to want exactly that as well. But just, I think, a combination of the messiness of the Brexit process on their end and the change to the Biden administration on our end has made that almost impossible. And it isn't just Britain in the case of Biden, as I was implying. His trade representative and his administration in general has been very skeptical of trade liberalization and seems to have completely cast its lot with protecting American industries and unions to the point that they're leaving a lot of positive trade steps completely on the table.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.